computers and art made with computers, often there's this idea that you can control everything and you're giving the computer instructions and you can create a lot of precision and repetition, and that can be both a process and an aesthetic output. But actually computers and technology in general are just as capable of kind of creating more unpredictable systems.
Welcome to another episode of Tech in the Arts, the podcast series of the Arts Management and Technology Laboratory. The goal of our podcast series is to exchange ideas, bring awareness, and stay on top of the trends. You're listening to our Art and Code podcast series, highlighting artists working at the intersection of performance, real-time visuals, and live coding. This series is in partnership with the Frank Ratchey Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University. My name is Hannah Brainard, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the lead researcher for Amped Lab. Today, I'm joined by Olivia Jack, a programmer, artist, and educator who works frequently with open source software, cartography, live coding, and experimental interfaces. She's developed browser-based creative tools including Hydra, PixelSynth, and LiveLab. Olivia, thanks so much for joining us today. Just to kind of start off, we'll go back into your background. You earned your bachelor's degree in engineering and product design with a minor in computer science at Stanford University. Could you talk a little bit more about your journey and how your engineering background informs some of your artistic practice?
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. I've always been really into art in a lot of different ways and just liked kind of making things and building things. And then I've also been really interested in math and science, and the design program was one way of sort of combining these interests in science and in making things. Since studying, I've pretty much only done computer science, I would say, and I wouldn't call myself a designer in any sense of the word, and even less so a product designer in some ways, but I'm sure kind of just ways of thinking about things, and especially aspects of a design process of like prototyping and continuous iteration are big parts of the way that I approach making things.
Yeah. What kind of things are you making now? What are some of your recent projects that excite you?
So my big baby ongoing project is called Hydra. I do consider her a sort of child in some ways, but Hydra is a software that I started making 6 years ago. That sort of, I don't even know. I think software is a good correct word, but it's basically a software for making live coded visuals, and where it's inspired by analog video synthesis, and it kind of lets you quickly write code directly in the browser and generate these video effects. There's also kind of collaborative components to it, and I think it's been this sort of journey of making the software and then seeing how people use it and then changing it and then making things with it, and then and I think I've made now a few different browser-based creative tools, and I really like the social aspect of building software, and especially open source software that other people can use and sort of hack and use for free, and then bring their own ideas to it, and it becomes this sort of international community of people who get into some really weird art practice and then meet each other through that.
Yeah. So kind of talking about that, could you tell us a little bit more about some of your live coding work?
So I actually first learned about live coding when I was living in Bogota, Colombia, and I lived there for about 5 years, and there was a kind of big community of live coding, which is a practice of writing code in real time to generate audio and visuals, and usually in a performative context. So you're like writing code in front of other people. And I had been a programmer for a long time, I've been programming since like 2009, but learning about live coding, at first I kind of didn't really understand it. I was like, why would people want to write code in front of other people? That sounds like really boring. But I think kind of meeting a bunch of people, especially in Colombia and other parts of Latin America where I was at the time, who would, go to the club or a party and write, make music using code, it changed the way that I started to approach developing software. And so as a software developer, usually when I've worked on a project, it's kind of like I write a piece of code or develop a piece of software, and it has certain functions and certain buttons and a certain user interface and way that you're supposed to use the software. But writing code that's meant to be live coded, part of it is like leaving the code as this open-ended thing that you can keep changing. And so it's much more of some sort of ongoing dialogue. And I think I'm just a curious person. I'm always interested in learning about different things, like how computer graphics work or how sound on the computer works. And so I like writing little bits of code to explore certain ideas, and then live coding lets me like keep editing that and exploring different ideas with the code.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you get to sort of collaborate using live code in some ways. Have you found a community around live coding?
Yeah, this has been a really big aspect of it. Something that's common in live coding is people will project their screen, so you can see kind of, as they're writing a bit of code, you can see what they're typing, and you can see the mistakes that they make, which is sometimes the funnest part, because there's some sort of like tension of, oh no, what's the mistake? And I think even if it's a language I'm familiar with, watching someone live code, I won't understand everything that they're doing, but just seeing this sort of a little bit of how someone is like thinking through creating something that you're watching or hearing, I find it really interesting. And it creates this sort of social space often where a lot of people who do live coding then will lead a workshop and share what they know with other people. And so sometimes with technology, there's this kind of, people can be protective of what they know with really technical things, and want to be like, oh, I'm an all-star media artist doing impossible things or something, and like the attraction to it, some of the selling point is like how complicated and seemingly magical it is, and live coding is a bit the opposite of some of what's interesting, is how kind of social it is and how much it can be about like sharing something or learning together or building your own tools. And so I like, especially when people like are experimenting with different kinds of tools and like building their own tools.
That's amazing. So talking about that, some of the maybe artistic elements that you incorporate in your work, I saw that you use a lot of feedback. Why does that interest you? And could you kind of tell us a little bit more about how that works within your artistic practice?
Yeah, so feedback, it's often when kind of the output of something becomes the input. So like, for example, when you have like two mirrors facing each other and then it looks like this infinite loop because each one is reflecting back into the other one. And in audio, it gets used a lot for like reverb effects, or just actually a lot of like effects in audio. And in video synthesis, it can create a lot of kind of like organic feeling types of visuals. And I think I am especially interested in it because of its unpredictability. And I think often computers and art made with computers, often there's this idea that you can control everything and you're giving the computer instructions and you can create a lot of precision and repetition, and that can be both a process and an aesthetic output. But actually computers and technology in general are just as capable of kind of creating more unpredictable systems. And I think within a creative process, I really like being able to have control over certain elements of what's happening and not have control over other elements of what's happening, and kind of use that as part of a process of making something interesting. And actually, I really like painting as well, and there's something also in applying paint to a canvas often where you're like placing broad strokes onto the canvas, but you're not like precisely controlling every like drop of paint. And I think there's some aspect of like layering things and then doing something and seeing what happens and adapting to that I really relate to in my coding practice, or like or at least in the visual outputs that I create with coding, that I really relate to painting.
That's amazing. So sort of moving out of your artistic practice and into more of your professional work, some of the same things might sort of apply, that there are areas where you have some control and some that you don't. For example, talking about some of your cartography and data visualization work with the anti-eviction mapping project, migration patterns, COVID-19 research. Could you talk a little bit more about the process in creating that and how you sort of represent the data in that work?
Yeah, I've worked for a variety of different contexts, often kind of for science organizations that are looking at sort of researching and distilling information about scientific processes to wider audience than an academic audience. And I think that is all still very visual for me, and kind of using code also to communicate kind of visual ideas. Specifically, the COVID-19 research that you mentioned, I didn't really do COVID-19 research, but I was working, the last few years I've been working for a lab in Berlin where I live now called the Research on Complex Systems Laboratory, and it's part of the biology and physics departments at Humboldt University. And part of the complex systems, or I'm botched understanding of it, but it's sort of describing and modeling parts of systems that are too complex to fully model what will happen. And so a big part of complex systems, often people will, like, someone will want to predict something, and often what I learned is that often the answer is no, we actually can't predict this. For example, in the case of something like COVID-19, nobody, even the most advanced scientists, could predict exactly what might happen, because there's so many scientific, biological, and social processes, like, all in conversation with each other. And so I'm going to bring this back to video feedback, but often ways of trying to model these types of things are kind of similar to these feedback simulations, where you can like describe certain behaviors and incrementally kind of visualize what could happen with them, but not fully predict what might happen. And so I was working at this website called Complexity Explorables that is part of this complex systems lab, and are interactive explanations of scientific concepts, and specifically kind of chaos theory and chaotic and unpredictable systems. And it turns out that those are very similar to video feedback. And so I really like being able to create creative tools in my own practice that let people often play around with some ideas that are complex math concepts, like differential equations, that just like looks like a pretty liquidy effect. And I think it's amazing to be able to play around with these things without necessarily having taken, 5 years of college math classes or something.
Now, my last question. So you said there's a lot that people cannot predict, but I'm going to ask you to do just that. Sort of looking ahead, what trends are you excited about and what do you hope to explore?
For me, I'm excited. I've been really stuck on the computer for a long time, and I've gotten to a point where often I can only imagine being creative on the computer. And I'm not trying to get completely away from the computer, but I'm trying to like bring some of what I like to do, which is kind of create playful tools and instruments, and bring them more to smaller physical devices or phones, or kind of like a hodgepodge of like hackable objects, so that I don't have to always rely on the computer to like feel creative.
Gotcha. That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate taking some time out of the busy weekend here at Carnegie Mellon. So
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Code series on Tech and the Arts. Be on the lookout for new episodes coming to you very soon. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to send this to another arts or technology aficionado in your life. You can let us know what you think of this podcast by visiting our website, ampedlab.org. That's amt-lab.org, or you can email us at ampedlabcmu@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram at Tech in the Arts, or Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. We'll see you next time.